Good evening. As Brother David said, it is good to have each one of you with us tonight. We do have some visitors, and we're glad that you've come our way, and we welcome you here to Pyburn Street. And we encourage you and invite you to come back and be with us any time that you can. Tonight, as announced, is our monthly question and answer night. And I always try to answer the questions that have been submitted in the order in which they were received. But sometimes, due to the subject matter or the timing of the question being submitted, sometimes I feel that it warrants moving a question from the bottom of the pile to the top of the pile. And that's what we're going to do tonight, because the question that we're going to be considering, we're actually going to split it up into a couple of different questions, but it's dealing with the season of the year that we are currently in. And so I thought it would be appropriate to deal with this question tonight rather than put it off for a later time. I want to begin tonight by reading the question just as it was submitted to me. It says, Josh, people always say that Jesus was born on December the 25th, but I have always been told that that is not the case. Was Jesus born on December the 25th? And if not, do we know when he was born? Now, that's a very good question, a very interesting question, one that I'm sure many people have wondered about, possibly have even studied about. So this evening, what we're going to do, we're really going to be discussing how the birth of Jesus relates to the modern observance of this holiday that we know as Christmas. Now, Christmas means different things to different people, but it is one of the most celebrated holidays throughout the world. In fact, the latest statistics that I could find said that 98% of American people celebrate Christmas to some degree. They celebrate in some way. Christmas is often the highlight of people's lives. So many times, especially those who are younger, they'll think about, well, how many weeks do I have left till Christmas? Or how many days until Christmas? And I don't know about you, but it seems like every year they start that countdown earlier and earlier every year. Seems like someday they're going to start on December the 26th saying, okay, we have 52 weeks until Christmas. But also, as we enter into the various stages of life, we see that this day comes to have different meanings. I know as a child, we looked forward to that day because that was the day we got to open presents. That was the day we got those new toys and we got to spend our day enjoying those things. But then as we get older, we start looking at this time more as a special time with family. A special time to display our love for one another through our generosity and the joy that we feel at watching those young people open those gifts. Seeing that joy in them that we once felt when we were their age. But I think most of us would agree that generally this is one of the most enjoyable times of the year. Just because of the focus upon so many of these wonderful traits, these traits of love and kindness and generosity. As the song says, it's the most wonderful time of the year. And I think many people believe that. But there are also many people in the world around us today who observe Christmas not simply as a secular holiday, but they observe it as a holy day. They look at December the 25th, what we call Christmas Day, as being the day of Jesus' birth. Well, this is why this question has been asked tonight. On one hand, you have millions of people saying that December 25th is Jesus' birthday. But on the other hand, you have probably just as many people saying, no, December 25th is not Jesus' birthday. So what's the truth on the matter? What's the answer to this question? And that's what we're seeking tonight. to find the answer to this question. Now, I want to break this question down, at least initially, into two different areas. The first that we're going to look at is December 25th Jesus' birthday? And then secondly, does the Bible even encourage us to celebrate the birth of Christ? So let's start with this first part. First, I'd like to establish that the Bible never tells us an exact day that Jesus was born. The Bible never tells us the month of the year. It never tells us any of those details. However, I do believe that the Bible presents enough information to us to show that without a doubt, Christ's birth would not have fallen in the wintertime. It would not have fallen in December. Therefore, it would not have fallen on December the 25th. But before we look at some passages that I believe support this conclusion, I want us to first look at some information that show us that this observance of December the 25th as Christ's birthday was not something that was even practiced until 200 years after the church came into establishment. Christ's birth was not signified in any way. It was not celebrated in any way. In the Encyclopedia Americana, it explains it this way. It says, Christmas was, according to many authorities, not celebrated in the first centuries of the Christian church, as the Christian usage in general was to celebrate the death of remarkable persons rather than the birth of remarkable persons. You see, it wasn't until the 3rd and the 4th century that this really became a common practice. And this was when Christians, and especially the citizens of Rome, began to recognize December the 25th as Jesus' birthday. But there was a problem. From the outset, there was disagreement as to when this needed to be celebrated. As we talked about a little bit this morning, once Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, they had an issue with many people still observing pagan feasts and festivals. And so in order to get people on board to support Christianity, what many people began to do was to try to place a Christian tangent or a Christian emphasis upon those feast times that had once been in celebration to false gods. But during that time, you can go back, and it's very interesting to me. You go back and you look at some of the deliberations and the studies that were made. And there were people even then, just 300 years after the death of Christ, that were already saying, well, no, Jesus, some said, was born in January, some said March, some April, some May, some September, and some December. Well, these arguments raged on for about 100 years. And actually, for a while, you had different groups of people celebrating Jesus' birth at different times of the year because they weren't in agreement as to when they felt that was supposed to be. But ultimately, over time, December 25th was the date that was chosen. And in the year 435 AD, the Roman Catholic Church made this an official holy day in their church calendar. On this day, they celebrated what they referred to as their first Christ Mass. And this is where our modern term Christmas originated. Now, the most likely reason that December 25th was the date that everyone settled upon was because December the 25th was a date that the Romans were already used to celebrating. And here is another interesting sideline to this. The Romans, for generations at this point, had been celebrating December the 25th as the birth date of their son, S-O-N, God. So then, when Christianity becomes the national religion of that realm, They get to thinking about this concept. Well, we describe Jesus as the Son of God, and we understand that He was the Son of God. So why not celebrate His birthday on the day that we've been celebrating the Son God's birthday? And so what they did, they took this pagan festival that they had been observing and simply switched it over from the celebration of their pagan sun god to the worship of Jesus Christ, to the recognition of His birth. What they found was that it was easier for them to simply place these religious connections in these festivals than to try to get the people to change their customs. This was something that they were so familiar with, so accustomed to, that they knew the people were going to continue to celebrate these things no matter what. And so rather than continue to celebrate something that was in celebration of a false god, well, let's just give it a religious connotation. Let's just apply this to Christ. Let's apply this, and we think about things such as Christmas. They applied Christ's birth. We think about Easter. They applied the resurrection of Christ. And so many of these things originated as pagan festivals. And they simply were carried over. One Catholic writer, a man by the name of Mario Righetti, he admits in his Manual of Liturgical History. Now listen to this statement. He said, to facilitate the acceptance of the faith by the pagan masses, the Church of Rome found it convenient to institute the 25th of December as the feast of the birth of Christ, to divert them from the pagan feast celebrated on the same day in honor of their sun god Mithras, the conqueror of darkness. And so this was something that they did to try to win people over to their side. It wasn't that they were trying to save their souls. It wasn't that they were trying to literally convert them to Christianity. What they were doing was trying to Christianize, if you want to put it that way, the society that they were in. To move people away from these false gods and to move them into thinking about the one true God of heaven. But simply in doing this, all they did was change, I guess you would say, change the personality, change the individual that these things were being attributed to. So this is how Jesus' birth came to be associated with Christmas. But now I want us to look at some passages that I believe make it tremendously clear that Jesus' birth would not have been in the winter of the year. Let's begin in Luke chapter 2. In Luke chapter 2, beginning at the first of the chapter, it says, and it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was the governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. So here we see that this great census has been decreed. A numbering of the people has to be made, but in order for this census to be done and their taxes to be paid, they had to go back to their ancestral homeland. They had to go back to the city of their fathers. Well, here we have Joseph, a man who came from the lineage of David. Bethlehem was the city of David, but they were not living in Bethlehem at the time. And so they had to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And here you have Mary, very, very much so along in her pregnancy. They travel this long, hard distance. Once they arrive there, she goes into labor. There's no room in the inn. And we remember how the story goes. They had to find shelter in a stable. But some things that I want you to consider is this. Folks, it is highly unlikely that they would have called for a census to be taken in the wintertime, because there were so many people that would have to travel great distances to go and pay their taxes and to fulfill this obligation. Many of those people would not have been able to make these journeys, especially if it was cold weather. We're going to talk about that a little bit more here in just a few minutes. You think about what it would be like on a night like tonight, having to either walk or ride on a camel or a donkey, having to be out in those kind of conditions for any period of time at all. But then you fast forward and think about what it would be like the way they're saying our weather is going to be later this week. It's something that would have been a great imposition on the people. And more than likely, this is something that would not have been done, because they wanted people to go. They wanted people to be counted. They wanted those taxes to be paid. And so they would have chosen a time that would have been much easier for people to make that journey, for them to travel. There's some writers that have suggested that this census more than likely would have been done in the fall of the year. And this is why we have some that argue that the birth of Jesus possibly would be sometime in the month of September. And the basis for that, they say, well, by that time, harvest would be over. And people would have a greater ease of travel, but not only that, they would have more money. They would have a greater ability at that time to contribute more. And so there is some logic to that point of view, that it could possibly have been in the fall of the year. But again, common sense would tell us that they would have chosen a time that would have been much better conditions. Not in the fall or late fall and winter of the year. You know, in that part of the world, we think this idea that that's the desert. You know, it's always hot, it's always dry. Well, no, it's not. I mean, there's areas that we read about in the Bible that still get quite a bit of snowfall every year. In some of those areas, their climate there is not much different than ours is here. And so we can understand just how difficult and just how harsh that could have been for a person to travel during the month of December. But also, if we look at the very next verse, we look at verse 8. I think this indicates as well that this would not have been in the wintertime. For it says, and there were in the same country shepherds, abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. Now, it was a common practice from about the middle of March until the middle of October for shepherds to move their sheep around to wherever they could find enough food, moving them around into different valleys and to different pastures. But then when wintertime set in and all of the grass began to die, they would take them back to their homes and they would stable them near their homes. They would have sheepfolds that they would keep them in during those winter months. And so, if this was December the 25th when Jesus was born, these shepherds would not have been out in the field. These shepherds would already be at home. They would already have their flocks put away and cared for the winter. But also, one commentator put it this way. It said, shepherds and their flocks would not be found abiding in open fields at night in December for the paramount reason that there would be no pasturage at that time. It was the custom, as now, to withdraw flocks during the months of October to November from the open districts and house them, or during the months October, November, they would move them from the fields out to their homes, and there they would be housed for the winter. Now, something that I've got to thinking about and that I looked up, just out of curiosity, I pulled up the weather forecast for the city of Bethlehem for the next week. if nothing changes on Christmas Eve night, it's going to be 38 degrees in the city of Bethlehem. Now imagine people having to travel in those kind of conditions. Imagine shepherds laying out in the fields trying to watch over their sheep during that time of year. Now, yes, we used to go out in conditions like that when we used to coon hunt. But that was the time that you do those things. But that's not the time that you sit out in the field and watch your flocks. Wasn't the time. But also another interesting point that oftentimes people mistake. Many of the nativity scenes that we see people setting up, oftentimes the figures that you see displayed there are not the shepherds. Oftentimes those shepherds are missing from nativity scenes, but there's three other figures that are there. Men that are known as the wise men or the magi. We're told that they came from the east and they brought gifts to Jesus. Now, the Bible never tells us how many of those men there were. But because we are told they brought three gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, it's been generally thought that there would have been three men. Each man brought a different gift. But we're not told that. But the shepherds were the ones that actually came and saw Jesus on the night of his birth. They were the ones that left their fields and they came to Bethlehem and they saw Jesus while he was still there, wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in the manger. But so often people have the misconception that the wise men did that as well. But no, the Bible tells us that the wise men did not come along for probably a couple of days later on. Because Jesus had already been moved from the stable and was already in a house by the time that the wise men came. But anyway, getting back to the point that we're looking at, another interesting fact about Jesus' birth is the year that he was born. There's a lot of different speculation. And most people, if you ask, what year was Jesus born? They say he was born in the year 0 AD. Well, guess what? If you go back and you look at the calendar, there is no 0 AD. The calendar goes from 1 BC to 1 AD. But also, whenever we think about this, there are many people that want to look at this and want to say, well, then Jesus would have been born in 1 AD. Well, in the year 525 AD, a Catholic pope by the name of John I asked one of his scholars, a man by the name of Dionysius, to create a new calendar. And he went back and he drew up this calendar based upon when he thought the birth of Jesus was. But he got it wrong. He missed it by about 4 years. Well, I can see by the looks on some of your faces, you're thinking, well, how do you know that? Well, in his calendar, he says that the birth of Jesus took place in 1 AD. But whenever we look at the introduction to the gospel accounts, who are we told was the king at the time that Jesus was born? A man by the name of Herod the Great. He was the one that was ruling over Judea at that time. You remember from our studies, especially from the book of Revelation, we talked about this political structure of the Roman Empire and how there would be kings that reigned over the different regions of the area. Augustus was the Caesar. He was the supreme emperor over the Roman Empire, but Herod the Great was the king over Judea. Well, secular historians have recorded for us the year that Herod the Great died, and guess when it was? 4 BC. But we know that he was still alive when Jesus was born, because he was the one that sent out the decree to have all the little babies put to death. So we see there's even a discrepancy on the year when Jesus was born. So not only do we not know the month, we don't know the day, we don't know the year that Jesus was born. And so more than likely, from this point of view and with this information, if we want to go based off our modern day calendar system, we would have to say that Jesus more than likely was born somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. Now, once again, I cannot give you a specific day when Jesus was born, but I can tell you based on my study that it would not have been in the winter. I tend to believe, simply based upon some of the internal evidence that we see there in the Scriptures, that it more than likely would have been in the spring. More than likely would have been around the end of the month of March or sometime in the month of April. But also, as I said, there is a possibility that it could have been sometime in the month of September as well, immediately following the time of harvest. But we don't have enough evidence to narrow that down any closer. These dates are based upon assumptions and speculations. We don't need to be dogmatic about any of these. But another thing that I do know, and this is something that many people in the religious world around us would not like to hear. But one thing I do know is this: if Jesus wanted us to celebrate His birth on a specific day each and every year, He would have told us when to do it. Correct? Amen. He would have told us when to do it. He wouldn't have left it up to man to try to figure it out. But, you see, the Bible in no case instructs us that we are to celebrate the birth of Christ on a specific day each year. And as I said, if it did, the Bible would tell us to do so. Would tell us what day to do this on. But Jesus does, however, tell us how He wants us to remember Him. He does tell us how and when He wants us to celebrate a certain aspect of His life. And it's not His birth. It's His death. You go back and you look at that statement that I shared with you earlier from the Encyclopedia Americana. And what did it say? It said the practice of the early church was to remember the death of remarkable people, not the day of their birth. If we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and this is a passage that's going to be very familiar to most of us, this is Paul's recounting of the way the Lord's Supper is to be observed. But I want you to notice what he has to say about remembering Jesus and what we are to remember especially about Him. Let's look at verses 23 through 26. Paul says, "For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which He was betrayed, took bread. And when He had given thanks, He brake it, and said, Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also He took the cup, when He had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye as oft as you drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show what? You do show the Lord's death till He come." You see, we are to remember the death of Christ. And we're to do this on a weekly basis as we observe the Lord's Supper. And this is intended to be a reminder to us of what Christ has done for us. So this is why I do not believe that Christians should celebrate December the 25th as Jesus' actual birthday. I don't think we should do that because the Bible doesn't tell us to do that. Now, let me tell you what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that the birth of Jesus is not important. I'm not saying that the birth of Jesus is not significant. I'm not saying that we are to treat His birth as some flippant matter that has no importance to our faith at all. Folks, this is the birth of the Son of God, the birth of the Savior. Yes, this is a significant event. But we need to recognize that Jesus, being associated with this modern day holiday, Christmas, December the 25th, is man ordained and not God ordained. Man is the one that set up this holiday. Man is the one that set up this observance, not Christ. But let me tell you something else. Folks, I am very thankful for the birth of Jesus every day, not just on Christmas Day. I'm thankful for it each and every day, just as I am thankful for His death each and every day. However, to me and to my family, as we observe the customs of Christmas, we simply celebrate this as a day to enjoy time with our loved ones, to focus on the relationship that we have with each other. And we don't apply to it any type of religious connotation whatsoever. But then the argument that we so often hear, well, isn't it a good thing to get people thinking about Jesus? Isn't Christmas a good occasion to draw people's minds to Jesus? Of course it is. Anything that's going to get people thinking about Jesus is a good thing. And Christmas, at least in a small way, makes some people start to think about what Christ has done for us. So at least in a small way, for that, I'm thankful. But just briefly before we close, let's ask this question. Is it a sin for Christians to celebrate Christmas? That's one that comes up from time to time. Well, since we don't recognize Christmas as the birthday of Jesus, since we don't consider it a holy day, should we observe it at all? There are some in the religious world around us today that do not celebrate any holidays because they say these days have not been set aside by God for those celebrations. Others look at it and say, well, yes, this is a man-made holiday, but since it comes from pagan origins, then we don't need to have anything to do with it. Others misinterpret Romans 14, 5 through 12, and say that, well, Paul is saying that we don't need to esteem one day over another. But is that really what he's saying in that passage? No. Because I dare to say that each and every week, we do esteem one day over the others, don't we? Think about the first day of the week. Those who are children of God, the first day of the week holds special significance to us, doesn't it? We come together on the first day of the week. We worship God together on the first day of the week. We remember the death of Jesus on the first day of the week. And even the Apostle John, by way of inspiration of the Holy Spirit, refers to the first day of the week as the Lord's Day. So no, Paul is not saying that it's wrong to esteem one day over another. But God's people have always been a celebrating and feasting people. Those of you that were able to be here last Sunday night for our end of the year fellowship, folks, we feasted and we celebrated. We had a good time together, didn't we? But you go back and you look. The Jews, they observed many God-ordained feasts and celebrations. We even see that some of them even joined in with some of the secular feasts of the day. There was nothing wrong with doing this. We come into the New Testament. We read about Jesus attending a wedding feast. We read about Him sitting down to banquets with His disciples, also sitting down to great feasts with those that are sinners. We read about Jesus and His disciples attending the feast days. So to say that Christians should never observe a holiday, I believe this would go against the examples we see set forth for us both in the Old and the New Testament. God's people have always been a celebrating people, have always been a feasting people. However, as Christians, we do need to be very careful in how we observe those holidays. The things that we apply to those days, especially when it comes to any type of spiritual connections that we may try to place upon those days. You know, we celebrate the 4th of July. We enjoy that holiday. It's a time of celebration where we celebrate the independence of our country. We get together with our families. We eat a lot of good food. We watch fireworks. We enjoy that time. But we don't apply any spiritual connection. We celebrate Memorial Day and Veterans Day in honor of those who have served in the military, those that have given their lives in battle. But again, we don't apply any spiritual connection to that other than possibly praying to God and thanking God for the service of those individuals. We celebrate Thanksgiving not because God has mandated that day, but because our country decided, it's a good thing to set aside at least one day a year to count our blessings. To think about what all God has done for us. Folks, there's never a bad time to be thankful. Never a bad time to give praise to God for what He has done. And yes, we can celebrate Christmas, but not as Christ's birthday, but as a time of year that brings people together, that focuses upon the traits of love, of giving and generosity, and again, feasting. We've always got to eat. We always have to have that part of it. And there's many customs that we observe. We decorate a tree, we decorate our homes, we string lights, we exchange gifts, we sing Christmas carols and the like. But we're never told that this is a day that we should set aside as Jesus' birthday. We're never told that we're to recognize this as a holy day. But once again, as I mentioned earlier, I do not see anything inherently wrong with using this as a day to focus greater attention on Christ, to make that application. Well, some people use this day to think about the birth of Christ, but we don't promote it as being the birthday of Jesus. One thing that I have found very interesting in my career is the number of people who celebrate their birthday on days other than their actual birthday. I can't tell you how many times I've had people come in and I'm meeting with a family of someone that's passed away, and I'll ask, well, what is their date of birth? They'll say, well, she was born on this day, but she celebrated her birthday on this day because she liked this day better. Or always told people this was her birthday because that was her best friend's birthday, and they always celebrated together. And so, you see, it's not that uncommon for people to celebrate their birth on days other than the actual day. But the issue at hand that we see here is placing a holy connotation to the day, saying that this is a day that God has ordained to be set apart to celebrate the birth of Christ. So if you want to use December 25th as a day to think about the birth of Jesus, you're certainly at liberty to do that. If you want to use that day as a time to reflect upon what His birth means to you, I see no reason why you couldn't do that. But just understand that December 25th is not a God-ordained holy day. It's not a day that every person must observe as the birthday of Jesus. And without a shadow of a doubt, I believe there's sufficient evidence to show that Jesus was not born on December the 25th. Well, I hope this lesson has taught you more about Jesus and how he relates to this modern holiday that we refer to as Christmas. And I hope also that we all will recognize and appreciate the birth of Christ. And not only on this one day of the year, but each and every day. Jesus is our Savior. His coming to this earth marked the beginning of a very special time. Because Jesus came to this earth, as we talked about in our Bible study this morning, as 100% God and 100% man. He came and he lived his life on this earth in such a way that it gave us an example of a perfect existence. And he gave his life so that you and I could have the hope of a home in heaven. Jesus' birth is what began those actions. So yes, it is a significant event. But tonight, as we bring this lesson to a close, let us all pause and let us reflect upon ourselves. Reflect upon our spiritual lives and ask ourselves this question. Is my heart right with God? Have I become a child of God in the way that God's Word has set forth through faith, repentance, confession, and baptism? Am I living the faithful Christian life? If not, make whatever corrections are necessary tonight. Obey the gospel. Be restored to the faith. Let us, as your brothers and sisters, assist you with our prayers and with our encouragement. But tonight, if you examine yourself and you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come at this time while together we stand and sing.